Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. The Channel 4 series Benefit Street provoked a media storm as soon as its first episode was shown. The programme features residents of a deprived street in Birmingham and has been criticised as poverty porn. Channel 4 has defended it as fair and balanced. So which is it? A fair reflection of deprivation in Britain, or a demonisation of those dependent on the state? And what does it say about the media's representation of those claiming benefits? Here to discuss this with me are Adam Memon, who's Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies, Steve Hart from the Class think tank, and Raoul Martinez, who's a writer and filmmaker. But first, Flaminia Giambalvo has more.
The Channel 4 documentary series Benefit Street, focusing on people living in one of the poorest streets in Birmingham, has immediately reignited a topic that polarises Britain.
I think the reason Benefit Street has provoked such a strong response is that it's touched on an issue that has been rising up the political agenda in recent years. People are increasingly concerned about whether the welfare system is fair and how much it costs the taxpayer. But equally, I think there's been a backlash because those who would like to defend welfare feel that it's representative of the media portraying the welfare system in an unfair way.
I think there's too many people in the welfare system in Britain.
I think the welfare system is a really good idea as long as it doesn't get abused too much.
The welfare system is terrible.
The merits of the show are still being debated. Some have argued the show is focusing on an unrepresentative sample, with 90% of the residents of James Turner Street relying on benefits. Welfare accounts for 16% of total government spending. However, less than half of this amount, about 5%, goes towards unemployment benefits.
I think it is true that too many people in Britain are relying on benefits, but that's more complex than we often hear in the public debates. Actually, many of those people who are relying on benefits are in work and not just out of work. So there is a challenge of helping a small proportion of people get off out of work benefits, but actually there are issues around low wages and high rents, which mean that welfare is more expensive than it need be.
One of the biggest public misconceptions in regards to benefits is the percentage that is claimed fraudulently.
It could be up to 10, 20%, 30%.
So half.
I'll probably say as high as 35%, I'll say.
Research carried out by the Trade Union General Congress shows that the actual amount is less than 1%. The current government has long argued that the benefit system creates dependency, which is damaging communities and trapping people into poverty. Consensus exists across all leading parties on the need to reform the welfare system, although there is no sure vision on how to do it.
I think some of the reforms being proposed by the government are necessary, simplifying the system so that people understand it and recognise that getting into work will bring financial reward as important. However, I think some of the other reforms are unnecessary. The bedroom tax is a good example. One of the problems is that it uproots people from their family networks.
Public concern on the impact the welfare system has on the taxpayer's wallet is at an all-time high. Whether these concerns play out on the ground remains to be seen. Flaminia Giambalvo, Islam Channel.
So Adam, I mean, as we showed in that package there, most people's perception of what's going on with the benefit system is wildly out of kilter with what's actually happening. They assume there's far more fraud than there actually is. This programme didn't help, did it?
Well, I think when you're talking specifically about the proportion of benefits which are claimed fraudulently, that's clearly the case. I mean, it's only really a small proportion of benefits which are claimed fraudulently. But I think this programme actually shows what it is like to live for sort of some people in our country. I mean, it's not the average. It's not most people live in such a way, but some people do, and it would be cruel if we didn't show how some people are forced to live in our country. We now have a system where we have a benefit system where if you are not able to find work, if you're essentially trapped on benefits, and that's how some sections of our country live. And I think this programme, unlike many other programmes, has shown that successfully, actually.
Steve, do you think the programme was just kind of a window on life for some of the poorest citizens, or do you think it was doing something worse than that?
I think it was a nasty little programme in common with a few other documentaries on TV. I think the programme also made embarrassing bodies. It's that kind of nasty highlighting the worst rather than talking about something typical. But what they're trying to do is imply, even just with the name Benefit Street, that this is something typical in Britain. And it is not. It is a million miles away from the reality of poverty in Britain for millions and millions of people who are working poor, who are on very low wages, are getting small benefits. They're seeing their bedroom tax imposed on them. They're seeing things getting worse, and they're struggling hard to make a decent living. And they're being portrayed like one of the characters in the first show, who frankly was a criminal, nothing but a criminal, and that somehow is linked with benefits. Where's the link?
Well, what do you reckon? Do you reckon it was highlighting how some people are forced to live, or do you think it was more judgmental than that?
I mean, I think the title says it all, really. You know, Benefit Street, that's the focus. And I think, broadly speaking, a good way to kind of measure or get a sense of the media's performance on this issue is to look at public opinion. You know, as the polls have shown, it's way off, and not just about fraud. I mean, if we look at the public's perception on, you know, welfare at large, you know, on average, people believe that 43% of the welfare budget goes to the unemployed, and it's only 3%. So, I mean, that doesn't just happen. That's a result of a media which has been acting as a megaphone for the government's narrative, which wants us all to believe that, you know, we're in the mess we're in economically because of the poor, the unemployed, the disabled, the sick, and immigrants. And of course, you know, that's ludicrous. And, you know, just thinking about this reminded me of a statement that came out last year from David Cameron, where he came out and he said he wanted to end the something-for-nothing culture, which I just found hugely ironic. You know, this is a man that was born into privilege, has had every advantage, and along with his wife is set to inherit £20 million, or over that, I think. And, you know, if inheriting millions isn't getting something for nothing, I don't know what is. So there is really something very wrong when you have a millionaire prime minister, a cabinet full of millionaires who are doing everything they can, really, to take money away from the poor and most vulnerable in our society.
I'm sure I can agree with that.
Just one more point on that, which, you know, there's a simple explanation, really, for why this is happening. And it's really that it's donors dictating policies. If we look at where the money is coming from for the Tory party, over 50% is coming from the banking sector, the financial sector, and that's who they're representing. And a further 13% is coming from private medical healthcare companies who stand to benefit from the ongoing privatisation of the NHS. So it's simply, you know, $1, one vote, replacing one person, one vote. You know,
I don't think a lot of that was actually relevant. I mean, firstly, the point that Steve made was that they tried to portray this as somehow sort of accurate of what's happening in the country, but they don't. Right at the beginning of the programme, they say, James Street is not an average street. They make that clear. And you know, another point of how sort of donors, I'm not really sure that's part of it, but I think this idea of somehow there's a media narrative which is driving sort of attitudes. Well, if that was the case, then maybe you would see sort of support for the welfare system and for higher welfare benefits drop sharply since the election. But in fact, that's not the case. It's been falling since the mid-90s. All throughout the Labour period in office, the public support for higher welfare spending has fallen, and that's because we've had so many people who have been trapped in this poverty trap, who are unable to get themselves out of it, who've not been supported by a government which essentially abandoned these people by saying, here are some benefits. We don't like to talk about it, but really, I mean, we should be angry. We should be angry. We should be angry that we've got these people living like this. We shouldn't be angry at people showing how people are living in this situation.
You say there's 5 hours of TV there. 2 people who are working were interviewed for the TV programme, but they've been cut out of that 5 hours. The only 2 people they interviewed that are working. That tells me there's a narrative that doesn't want to talk about the working poor, that wants to try and have a distortion. It's exactly the same kind of distortion that they use in relation to terrorism. They show a terrorist who happens to be Islamic, and the logic is they say, therefore, all terrorists are Islamic and all people of Muslim origin are terrorists. That's what they're trying to do. That's the elision that they try to do with this kind of programme. And that's exactly why people have this distorted view of what welfare spending is about. They don't realise that the bulk of welfare spending is on pensioners. That's the vast majority of welfare spending is on pension. They're doing it today. Yeah. Today they announced something about migration and unemployment. And they blame it on Poles from Eastern Europe and the other Eastern Europeans that have come to this country. Do you know how many people claim unemployment benefit from Eastern Europe? 13,000. Yet there are rafts of government policy that are about that. And it's distortion, distortion, distortion.
Okay. So Adam, what do you say to that? That essentially what the programme did is it took a rotten apple and said the whole barrel's like this.
No, but it didn't. I mean, the point is right at the beginning of the programme, they say this is not an average street. The point of Benefit Street, unlike so many other programmes, so many other newspaper columns, is it shows something that we haven't seen before, which is that there are some areas of our country where there is serious deprivation, where there is serious worklessness, where there are problems with the benefit system, where there are problems in finding employment, and these things aren't covered in other areas. The point that is made usually is that these are scroungers. Of course, these are mostly, vast majority of the time, they're not scroungers. We're able to see how many people are facing serious problems which are often out of their control. But something like this we just haven't seen in other programmes, which finally we are able to see.
Right.
Yeah, I just think it's a ridiculous notion that the poverty trap comes from giving people benefits. The poverty trap comes from a system which privileges a few at the expense of the many, which takes away the opportunities from the majority. It comes from a highly unequal society. It's got nothing to do with giving benefits to people, as if, as soon as you give them money, they lose all motivation to go and seek work. It comes from a system, essentially neoliberalism, which hasn't provided enough work, which hasn't provided living wages to people, and which has been subsidised by the state as a result. That's where the failure lies. It doesn't lie with giving benefits to few people at the bottom of society. I just think that's a ridiculous narrative.
The poverty trap comes from marginal tax rates on the very low earners, which make it essentially worthless to work.
That's nonsense.
Yes,
facts are wrong.
When you work,
I think we'll go in this order. Adam and Steve.
So what is the point of work? For many people, it's simply irrational to work or to work even more hours. Because when you work more hours, then you're facing income tax, you're facing national insurance, you're facing the withdrawal of benefits. So I think there's one person on this programme, White D, I think she's called, who faces a 91% marginal income tax. So that essentially means that for every £1 she earns, so she moves from minimum wage to living wage, she earns 9 pence more, or about 15 pence more overall. It's simply not worth working. We need to focus more on lower pays.
Let's deal with that point, because that's a point often repeated by the government, Steve. That this is about. It's not about low wages. It's about bad taxes.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Job seekers allowance is £71. It's a miserable amount of money. How somebody can live on that, I really don't know. But the fact is, if you look at all the statistics show that for every group, whether it's single, with children or whatever, that by working on the minimum wage for 30 hours a week, you earn more than you get through, quote, welfare. Now, I want to increase the minimum wage. I think it ought to be increased immediately by £1.50. I think we ought to move the minimum wage up to the living wage and ensure that employers pay far more. That would get a bigger gradient from benefit to work. But is the answer that you're implying that you need to cut benefit, cause deprivation to be worse, cause poverty to grow? Because that's what the government is doing. 27% of children in this country live in poverty. The government's policies mean that several more percent by 2020 will become poor.
In a moment, Adam, but to Raoul first.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to reframe it slightly. I mean, I'm not really concerned about this poverty trap. I'm concerned about the wealth trap, a benefit system which is really transferring wealth from the poorest of society to the top of society. And we saw that with the crash recently. The people who have caused it have come out, the bankers, the financial sector, they've come out with incredible amounts of money. Last year, I think bankers' bonuses amounted to 14 billion. And that's at a time where we've had, the highest rate of people using food banks, I think, that we've had, for decades. And people needing payday loans more than they've ever needed just to make it to the end of the month.
Well, let me bring Adam back in on that point. That both Steve and Raoul have made this point now. That the problem with your solution to it is that you're creating even greater deprivation on the theory that if people are that much more deprived, then they're bound to go to work.
No, but that's not the argument that they're making at all. What I'm saying is that we should make it more worthwhile for people to get into work. So once they find a job, or once they're already in a job and want to work more hours, we should reduce.
Are you agreeing that the wages should go up then?
Oh, so of course we want wages to go up, but the question is, of course, is how you do that. So whether people are working already, it doesn't make any sense for people to be taxed, then to have the government to organise that and then to receive some of the benefits anyway. You may as well just cut taxes and reduce some of the bureaucracy that comes with that. We should be encouraging productivity growth, which encourages wage growth. We should be trying to boost the supply side of our economy, which makes it easier for people to enter the labour market. We should be making sure we skill our younger people with greater numbers of apprenticeships, through an education system which makes them more equipped for entering the labour market. And once people are in the labour market, they should not be paying as high taxes as they are, because it should be worthwhile to work as even more hours than they are.
So you'd support increasing the minimum wage up to, for example, in London, the London living wage is £8.80. You'd support taxing the rich, taxing the bankers' bonuses, and reducing the tax on ordinary working people. You'd support that, would you?
Well, I think the issue of bankers' bonuses is a totally side issue. It's nothing to do with the poverty trap, actually. It's a entirely separate issue. The question is how we raise revenue. That's one issue.
Tax the bankers.
But okay, that'll raise you £2 billion. We have a deficit of £100 billion. It's really a minuscule. It's a minuscule part of it. In regards to the minimum wage, there are questions about in London the minimum wage is below market rates anyway, so it's not particularly. Doesn't really have any impact on jobs. Yeah. But in other parts of the country, in Leeds or where I'm from, the real prices are 25% lower than London, so the minimum wage does have a more of a significant impact there. There are also questions in terms of whether it makes incentivise moving to capital industries more than labour intensive. So minimum wage is perhaps not the best way, but it certainly should be considered.
I have to stop you there because we're at the end of the first part of this programme, but this debate, hotly contested here as in the society at large, will be continued in the second part. Join us after the break.